山韵海秀，海纳百川。在山东半岛的最东端，波澜壮阔的黄海与造化钟灵的赤山，孕育了充满活力的大型民营企业集团——赤山集团。
The Chishan Group first entered onto the radar for us in 2019 while investigating reports of Chinese squid ships fishing in North Korean waters in breach of international sanctions. In 2017, in response to North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile tests, the United Nations Security Council imposed sanctions intended to deprive the North Korean government of foreign currency. This included banning the presence of all foreign fishing vessels in North Korean waters. Since then, though, hundreds of Chinese ships have ignored these sanctions and continued to operate there. 10 vessels. The presence of large industrial Chinese ships was putting added pressure on squid stocks, forcing North Korean fishermen to venture further out to sea to meet their quota. And in their rickety, ill-equipped boats, many of these fishermen were getting lost at sea or falling victim to storms. Their broken and battered boats then washed up on Japanese shores, often with the bodies of dead North Korean fishermen still inside.
I think the first evidence we saw of perhaps questionable behavior by Chishan vessels was the fact that the number of those vessels had fished in North Korean waters in the last number of years. This is in breach of sanctions.
We were able to identify these vessels fishing in North Korean waters using satellite tracking. So by using the satellite imagery, you're able to see what vessels are where. And so you can see that they're in those waters where they shouldn't be at that time. And then using ownership records and documentation, you can check who owns those vessels.
The satellite tracking data, when it was matched with corporate records, clearly pointed to Chishan vessels as being part of this huge illegal fishing fleet that was in North Korean waters and helping drive the collapse of the squid stocks there. So we began looking deeper at Chishan's supply chain, and we started to see other pretty worrisome patterns of behavior among these ships.
So there are a number of issues with Chishan-owned vessels. We've seen issues with AIS disabling. And I think even more significantly perhaps, it tranships with vessels as well routinely that have committed infractions like illegal fishing. There may have been cases of beriberi on board, things like forced labour, rights abuses, trafficking. And we also had a couple of cases of injuries on board with injured deckhands disembarked in Montevideo in 2021 and 2022.
So at this point in our investigation, we were actually focused more on Montevideo, Uruguay, which is a major stopover for Chinese squid ships that operate off the Atlantic coasts of South America. And we were focusing there partially because there was data that indicated, on average, Chinese vessels and other vessels were dropping off one dead crew member every 6 weeks, which was a pretty alarming number in our view. So in February 2022, my team and I went to Montevideo to investigate. There we met Jessica Reyes, who's one of the only Indonesian language translators in the city. Many of the deckhands on Chinese squid ships are from Indonesia. And for those deckhands who are sick or injured, Jessica is often their only lifeline.
Pak masih tetap sama ya, kirain ganti.
Over the years, Jessica's translated for hundreds of Indonesian deckhands in distress, and she told us about a particular young man she had met in early 2021. His name was Daniel.
So during Ian's visit to Montevideo, we zeroed in on this specific case of an Indonesian deckhand named Daniel. Daniel had been dropped off on the port in really grave condition. His body appeared to contain bruises from what looked like beatings. His body was swollen, skin was yellow, and he died shortly after arriving in port. This seemed like a significant case where we're looking at potentially not just illness or neglect, but also violence. And so we wanted to tell Daniel's story and find out exactly what we could about him.
Just prior to his death, Daniel had been working on a Chinese squid ship called the Zhenfa 7. He most likely died from complications caused by malnutrition, which raised major human rights concerns aboard the ship.
So the Zhenfa 7 is part of what is now known as the Chinese squid fleet. What happens with this fleet is that Indonesian deckhands are hired for periods of up to 2 years, sometimes even as long as 3 years. They go out to sea and they fish these waters. Sometimes they don't return to port for that entire period of time. But while they're out at sea, there is a fleet that supports them, and this is a fleet of refrigerated vessels called reefers. And this is where we see the connection with the Zhenfa 7 and the Chishan Group. One of those reefers that regularly travels to the fishing grounds is called the Lurong Yuan Yu Yun 009. It's owned by the Chishan Group, and it has regularly transshipped with vessels owned by Zhenfa 7's parent company, which is Roncheng Wangdo, including the Zhenfa 7 itself.
To trace where the Zhenfa 7 squid went, we tracked the Chishan reefer by satellite to Shidao port in a place called Shandong province, which is a major seafood processing hub in China. We then hired a team of private investigators to locate and photograph the squid as it was offloaded from the Chishan reefer. That team was able to photograph squid bags that had the name of the Zhenfa 7's parent company on them. That company is called Roncheng Wangdo.
So when squid arrives back to port in Shidao, it's unloaded at the port and then it's carried by trucks to processing plants. Chishan Group owns a number of processing plants near to the port. Two of those, Rongcheng Haibo and Shandong Haidu, are two of the largest squid processing enterprises in China. So we arranged for a site visit to Chishan Group processor, and while there, video and images were taken of squid bags arriving to the facilities. Two of those bags that were photographed were from a vessel called the Ningtai 83 and another vessel called the Hongpu 37. Now, these two vessels are owned by companies that have a really extensive record of issues. These two companies are particularly bad actors with a number of different vessels with serious issues. Illegal fishing, cases of beriberi, neglect, deaths on board, forced labour, really you name it.
So through some of the imagery taken during those visits, you can see very clearly that some of the squid product is actually all packaged and ready to go in boxes for a Spanish company called Inlet Seafish. You could see very clearly the name of the product. You could also see the plant code for the company that's stamped onto it as well. So those are basically all set and ready to roll.
So that site visit was pretty key in allowing us to establish, with our own eyes, I suppose, that these plants were taking in squid from all sources, lots of different issues, red flags all over the place. And as I mentioned, every issue that we're trying to find as we do our research: forced labour, trafficking, illegal fishing, so serious issues.
Through this phase of the investigation, we were able to prove with a reasonable amount of certainty that Chishan ships had indeed fished illegally in North Korean waters, and that their reefers, the refrigeration ships, and processing plants were taking in squid that was tainted by illegal fishing, human rights abuses, or both. But as we looked into the Chishan Group's corporate materials, we uncovered a trove of information that pointed to human rights abuses on land as well.
We combed the Chishan Group website when we began looking into the company. We were looking for images of squid vessels. We were looking for really any kind of background on the company. I suppose in some way we didn't know what we were looking for, other than that we knew we had to go through this website very rigorously. And it was during that process that we identified an old press release which discussed the arrival of Chinese officials to the plant.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chishan Group released newsletters in which it described severe production bottlenecks at its seafood processing plants in Shandong. The solution, which was offered to Chishan Group by Shandong government officials, was to start bringing workers from Xinjiang.
The Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China's far northwest is the ancestral home of the Uyghur people, who are one of China's largest ethnic minorities. And since the early 2000s, the Chinese government has subjected the Uyghurs to pretty severe human rights abuses, including mass internment and forced labor. In response to human rights concerns for the Uyghur people and to keep products produced by forced labor from entering U.S. markets, the American government banned the import of Chinese goods produced wholly or in part by Uyghur labor.
What we found on the website were about 100 newsletters, essentially internal corporate newsletters aimed at staff. And in those newsletters, the issue of labour transfer from Xinjiang was extensively discussed. There was celebrations for the first arrival of Xinjiang workers with photos of the Xinjiang workers arriving. There was discussion about the dietary needs of these Muslim workers, predominantly Muslim workers. So it was all very openly discussed in Chishan's own corporate literature.
In addition to the Chishan Group's own corporate materials, we also found the issue of labor transfers openly discussed in state media. In China, the labor transfer program is branded as a form of poverty alleviation, so state-controlled news outlets report on it pretty widely and openly, often painting a rosy picture of grateful workers and patriotic corporations.
At this stage in our investigation, we still only had documentation from both the company and the Chinese government that described labor transfers or the presence of Uyghur workers at these plants. We really wanted to verify that in 2023 there were no Uyghur workers at these factories. In order to do that, we turned to social media, and to one platform in particular, and that was Douyin, or the Chinese version of TikTok.
And somewhat surprisingly, we were able to find a lot of Uyghur workers were uploading videos from their own lives, their own workplaces to Douyin. And among those workers were workers with the Chishan Group.
By using a form of social network analysis, we were able to identify a large number of Uyghurs who we believed had been transferred from Xinjiang to Shandong. And within that population, there were user accounts posting to Douyin footage that showed individuals working in seafood processing factories and walking around the compounds of seafood processing factories.
To verify where the Douyin videos had been filmed, we used a variety of techniques, including looking at the workers' uniforms and any factory signage pictured in the video. We also used a form of geospatial analysis in which we compared the footage that we were seeing to satellite imagery of known Chishan plants like Roncheng Haibo. In this video, a Douyin user who we verified as being Uyghur records himself walking outside a processing plant. In the video, you can see dormitories set next to a workshop with a blue roof across from loading docks, which match perfectly with satellite imagery from Roncheng Haibo, a Chishan plant nearly 2,000 miles from Xinjiang.
We identified at least 218 workers that were transferred to the Chishan Group. We identified them through Douyin accounts. We identified them through state media reports and also through the Chishan Group's own materials, which, particularly the corporate newsletters, which mentioned specific figures of how many had arrived at such and such a time and so on.
What usually happens, or what should happen when you're reporting on a company or a person, is that you contact them beforehand and you give them adequate time to explain their situation or to be made aware of some finding that you have about them. So initially we sent them actual physical letters that were sent by courier to the companies. We contacted them at Chishan Group, the actual corporate top level. We also contacted the individual processing companies who we were going to name.
The Chishan Group's corporate office never replied to our letters or emails, and neither did Shandong Haidu initially. But Roncheng Haibo did engage with us, and they denied all of our findings. Haibo said that they have no affiliation with any ships that fish illegally or commit human rights abuses. When presented our findings that they had been recipients of state-sponsored labor transfers from Xinjiang, they denied that as well. They stated, quote, "Haibo has never employed any Xinjiang workers," end quote.
One of the most surprising things, I suppose, that we identified was most of the evidence that we gathered was directly from the Chishan Group itself. So, for example, you log on to the Roncheng Haibo website. The first picture you see is of a vessel that was tracked fishing in North Korean waters in the last 5 years. So it's the first thing you see on the website. Next, the Uyghur workers. Again, it's all directly from their own materials, their own website. So when they're saying it themselves, that gives you a lot of confidence that this is happening.
We identify shipments of seafood from Chishan Group facilities being exported to scores of countries, including United States, Spain, Germany, Netherlands, Portugal, Switzerland, Italy, Greece, Morocco, Vietnam, Philippines, Sri Lanka. The list goes on.
I think it's more complicated than just describing, for example, the Chishan Group as an individual bad apple. For consumers, what they might want to take away from this is how complicated the seafood industry is, how complex supply chains are, and how it is up to you as a consumer to check. We produced a tool that we've called Bait to Plate, and it's for consumers, for anyone at all really, to have a look and see how the supply chain pans out and what the connections between companies could be to vessels that have been involved in IUU or fishing abuses at sea, or any of the issues that have been raised in our investigation. If these things are important to you, if it's important to you that your food is not being produced by people who are being abused, or it's not being procured through illegal activities, this bait-to-plate tool is kind of a start, but it's only a glimpse of the entire picture.
The Chishan Group became a focal point for our investigation for 3 reasons. The first is that it's so big. It produces over 30% of China's squid and over 17% of all US imported squid. The second is that it is involved in nearly every step of the seafood supply chain, owning its own fishing vessels, refrigerated cargo ships, and processing facilities. And third, because the evidence that ties Chishan processing facilities to Xinjiang labor is so strong. But the bigger picture here is that the Chishan Group is not unique, and the issues we found in the Chishan Group's supply chain are not exclusive to them. What we found was that many companies are tied to a variety of similar problems with forced labor or illegal fishing. And truth be told, the pervasiveness of these problems is why the global seafood industry likely will have to assess how it monitors its supply chains, especially those that route through China.